Okay, this is the U.S. Studies Causes of the American Revolution. It is important that we understand what happened here. Causes of the American Revolution. America was expected to be an independent nation. God designed it that way. That's why he brought it forth, and for the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The country had to have certain characteristics. It had to have freedom of religion, and it had to be not under the auspices of the British rule in order for that to happen. It also had to be a place where religions could be established, new religions, and so forth. So that is probably the basis, the basic reason that the War for Independence, the American Revolution, had to take place, and one of the causes of it. Now let's get down to more of the political and the actual things that caused that to happen. Now, number one, the French and Indian War was over in 1763, but in 1763, George Grenville was the prime minister in England, and he made the Proclamation of 1763, which canceled all previous land grants given to the colonies by past kings and parliaments. Okay, he banned settlement in all the lands west of the Appalachians. Now, after the French and Indian War, many of the colonists felt, well, we can go west. There's land out there. We can get it. And Grenville said, oh, no, you can't. You are going to have to be along the seaboard from the foothills of the Appalachians to the sea. And that did not sit well with the colonists, with the Americans. Now, there were also new taxes. Okay, the French and Indian War had been very expensive. The English treasury was just about bankrupt and so forth, and so they felt that well, the Americans, the colonists, should pay for some of this, because after all, we had troops over there. We were fighting to protect them from the French and the Indians and so forth, and they should pay their portion. And so we had new taxes, okay? One of the taxes, the first one, was the Stamp Act. Now, the problem is that under the British Constitution, Brits had a say in whether or not they were taxed. They were to have representatives in Parliament. Well, the colonists didn't have any representatives in Parliament, and so they felt that being taxed was taxation without representation, which they had been guaranteed by the English Constitution. And so this was a problem. The Stamp Act of 1765 required the colonists to buy stamps or seals from government agents for all legal documents, such as wills, bills of sale and licenses, pamphlets, and newspapers. Anyone caught evading the Stamp Act could be tried without jury. Now, this was another violation of their rights as Englishmen, even though British law guaranteed the right of trial by jury. The colonists resented that they did not have the same protection as Englishmen in the mother country. So that was a problem, okay? Now, also there was the Quartering Act of 1765. Parliament passed this, and this act was intended to reduce the high cost of colonial defense. It required colonists to furnish British troops with certain supplies and living quarters. Soldiers were to be housed in taverns, barns, sheds, and vacant buildings, and colonists who furnished goods and shelter were to be reimbursed by the colony in which the troops were stationed, not the mother country. As it came down, troops were housed in homes, and those who owned the homes lived in the barns. So it was, again, another sore spot for the colonists. Now, in June of 1765, the Massachusetts legislature called for the colonies to send representatives to form a unified response to the Stamp Act. 9 colonies responded, and the Stamp Act Congress convened on October 7th in New York. New York City. Okay, these representatives petitioned directly to the king, asking him to, 1, defend their rights as Englishmen to resist any taxation without due representation, restore their royal charters, which granted representative powers to the colonial assemblies to determine taxes. They had their own assemblies. They'd been doing this for 150 years or so. And so, this was taking away their rights and their home rule, their self-government, and to restore the land grants to the original colonies. Well, it didn't happen. Okay. A few men in the British Parliament understood the problems, William Pitt the Elder and Edmund Burke, but finally, in 1766, after a convincing speech by William Pitt the Elder on behalf of the colonies, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. However, the same day, Parliament adopted the Declaratory Act, declaring that the colonies were subordinate to Britain, and that Parliament had the power to pass laws to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That did not sit well, not sit well at all. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before. As a teenager, you grow up and you are given more and more freedom and ability to make your own decisions and so forth. So when you're 20, if your parents all of a sudden say, well, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you go, wait, what? No. I'm my own agent unto myself. I can do things as I please, and I don't have to listen to you anymore. This happens quite often. So, but this is the kind of the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies, that they had been granted self-rule for so long, and they had gotten so good at it with all their assemblies and so forth, and their town meetings and their colonial legislatures and so forth, and governors, that for Parliament to say, okay, this is what you're going to do, it was a real problem. Now, the Townshend Act. Okay, Charles Townshend became the new Prime Minister of England. He did not at all sympathize with the colonies, and he felt that there should be some other acts. Okay, there were a series of taxes levied called the Townshend Acts on colonial imports from Britain, including paper, paints, lead, glass, and tea. The Townshend Acts also established a board of customs in Boston to oversee the collection of these taxes, and created special courts to try customs dodgers without a jury. Again, a violation of the British Constitution. Special documents called writs of assistance allowed British officials to search American ships and buildings for smuggled goods, and they did smuggle. The reaction in the colonies was not good. They reacted as they had to the Stamp Act. They insisted that by British law they should be protected from taxation without representation. The suspension of colonial legislatures alarmed many, for it seemed to threaten self-government in the colonies. Soon pamphlets and letters began to circulate voicing opposition to the Townshend Acts. When Great Britain failed to respond, the colonists resorted to boycotts, refusing to import British goods, and eventually this came to the point where the merchants in England asked that the Townshend Acts be discontinued. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about is the fact that they brought troops into Boston and so forth. It says by early 1770, Boston was brimming with tension. The New Englanders didn't like that, what was going on. And finally, on March 5th, 1770, an unfortunate incident brought the conflict into the open. A group of boys threw snowballs and rocks at a British sentry at the customs office. When he called for help, British soldiers and local citizens came running. Soon an angry crowd began to harass the soldier, and shots rang out. There were 5 colonists that were killed, among whom was Crispus Attucks. One of the patriots, John Adams, just felt like in order that these soldiers needed to have somebody give them a fair trial, and so he took on their defense. I believe 7 of them were acquitted and 2 had light sentences. But it was called the Boston Massacre, and it just didn't sit well with people throughout the colonies, that would happen. So anyway, the Townshend Acts were repealed by a new Prime Minister, Frederick North, in 1770. He did not sympathize with the colonies, but he realized that it was cost more to enforce the law than to keep it. So all the Townshend Acts were repealed except the tax on tea. Now, we have committees of correspondence. During these years, it was relatively calm. There were Samuel Adams of Boston filled the newspapers with letters warning colonists that the peace with Great Britain was temporary and that the real problems had not been solved. At his suggestion, Boston formed the first committee of correspondence in 1772. This committee of 21 men kept neighboring towns informed of problems with Britain and let America's position be known to the world. Soon, committees of correspondence had been organized throughout the colonies, and these committees played a vital role in the struggle for freedom and the war for independence. Okay, so the Townshend Acts were all repealed except for the tax on tea. So you can imagine what happened next. The Boston Tea Party. It was only 3 cents per pound. But again, the colonists were not happy with that, and on the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of citizens disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the ship, threw over 342 chests of tea, this was loose tea, and into the harbor. So it outraged the British authorities, and they responded with the Intolerable Acts. They put Massachusetts under martial law, which that means any self-governing was no longer in force. It was under the Army, under the British Army. And they sent General Thomas Gage to replace Governor Hutchinson. A new quartering act made it legal for British officials to house British soldiers in occupied buildings. The Boston Port Bill closed the port of Boston. Other laws restricted the colonists' freedom to govern themselves, and the colonists lost their traditional rights as Englishmen. They despised these actions and called them the Intolerable Acts. Now, the way that Massachusetts was being punished bothered the rest of the colonies, bothered Edmund Burke in Parliament. He said, "This is the day then that you wish to go to war with all America." Even General Gage, the new military governor of Massachusetts, realized that temporarily housing soldiers in private buildings would lead to great conflict. So what happens here? Lord North, who was the Prime Minister at the time, assumed that the other colonies would not be concerned about the trouble with Boston, but he failed to understand that the colonies had become more unified, particularly through the Great Awakening and the committees of correspondence and so forth. They kept tabs on what was going on with each other. When Virginians heard that the port of Boston was to be closed, the Virginia House of Burgesses proclaimed a day of fasting and prayer. As the news spread, people throughout the colonies sent relief. Connecticut sent large amounts of rice, flour, fish, pork, and beef. The town of Kingston, New Hampshire, sent 100 sheep. Virginia sent grain. A steady stream of wagon trains rolled into Boston, hauling supplies from as far away as South Carolina. As historian Edward Channing wrote, "Never before in American history, and possibly never before in any history, had the waves of sympathetic enthusiasm mounted so high as those that now rolled from south to north and from north to south." Okay. Now, in 1774, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which canceled the American colonies' western land claims by extending the borders of Quebec south to the Ohio River and west to the Mississippi. So they're taking land away. Some colonists feared that Bible reading and evangelism might be completely prohibited in the vast western lands which they so much wanted to settle. For years, colonists had feared having their religious affairs dictated by a state church. The Quebec Act only heightened this fear of future religious liberty. So, what happens? In June 1774, the colonial legislatures called for a meeting in Philadelphia of delegates from each of the colonies to discuss what action should be taken. This became known as the First Continental Congress, convened September 5th, 1774. All of the colonies except Georgia sent delegates. Okay? The purpose of the Congress adopted its declaration and resolved. It said that the inhabitants of the English colonies in North America, by the immutable laws of nature, the principles of the English Constitution, and the several characters or compacts, have the following rights. Among the rights listed were these. Okay, now this is what we're talking about. They figured that their rights were being violated, and they were. They were. So number one, that our ancestors who first settled these colonies were at the time of their emigration from the mother country entitled to all the rights, liberties, and immunities of free and natural-born subjects within the realm of England. And now the government was taking it away. 2, that by emigration they by no means forfeited, surrendered, or lost any of those rights, but that they were, and their descendants now are, entitled to the exercise and enjoyment of all such of them as their local and other circumstances enable them to exercise and enjoy. We have our rights, and we expect to be able to exercise them. Number 3, the foundation of English liberty and of all free government is a right in the people to participate in their legislative council. And as the English colonists are not represented, and from their local and other circumstances cannot properly be represented in the British Parliament, they are entitled to a free and exclusive power of legislation in their several provincial legislatures. Okay, so they said that the legislature power rested in the provisional or colonial legislatures. These resolves recognize the authority of the king, but no authority of Parliament over the colonies. As James Wilson, one of the future delegates to the Second Continental Congress, said, all the different members of the British Empire are distinct states, the independent of each other, but connected together under the same sovereign. The colonists recognized Parliament to be the legislative body for Great Britain, but not for the rest of the king's domains. Well, reaction in Britain. What do you suppose happened in Britain? Well, in Britain, the actions of the First Continental Congress seemed unimportant. Edmund Burke and a few others tried to persuade Parliament to take a wiser course of action with the colonies, but Parliament, Lord North, and George III were determined to rule America as they pleased, if necessary by force. George III remarked, blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. Okay, and he was egged on by his mother, who said, be king. Be king, exercise your powers, you know. And so he was kind of a mama's boy. Okay. On March 23rd, 1775, Patrick Henry made a speech to the Second Virginia Convention in which he foretold the fast approaching conflict and spoke with the sentiments of an ever-growing number of Americans. Quote, it is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of change and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Okay, so there you have it. And that is what led up to what turned out to be the Board for Independence. Okay, now the next lecture will talk about some of the spiritual things that went on, and so stay tuned for that one.